Hello, and welcome to Line and Mouse Commentary. I'm Holland, and this is my best friend Tori.
Hey!
If you're new to our show, we rank various forms of entertainment by different categories out of a total score of 10, with only 2 points allowed for our personal taste. Don't worry, we break everything down as we go. Feel free to agree, disagree, or just find something new to enjoy. Just be sure to tread lightly, there will be hot takes and spoilers. Cut to the intro, Tori. Alrighty, so today we are wrapping up Avatar the Last Airbender Season 1. This is familiar content to both of us, and if you haven't listened to our first 4 episodes... 3 episodes?
3.
Yeah.
3 previous Avatar episodes.
3 previous Avatar episodes, then go ahead and listen to those if you don't want any spoilers. So... before we get started, just as a synopsis, I'm going to kind of recap and give a little spoiler-free background before we get into our scores. So, Avatar the Last Airbender was a animated TV show on Nickelodeon created by Michael Dante DiMartino and Brian Konietzko. The series follows the main protagonist Aang and his friends who have to save the world by defeating the Fire Lord Ozai and ending the destructive war with the Fire Nation. It aired on February 21st, 2005, and the series concluded, a total of 3 seasons, concluded in July 2008. The cast includes Zach Tyler Eason, Mae Whitman, Jack DeSena, Dante Basco, Jesse Flower, D. Bradley Baker, Mako, Greg Baldwin, Gray Delisle, and Mark Hamill. The last episode we reviewed was episode 15, Bato of the Water Tribe from season 1. Just a little recap of that episode. Aang meets Bato, who is a member of Sokka and Katara's Water Tribe. Aang betrays Katara and Sokka's trust by withholding information from them regarding the whereabouts of their father's fleet. Katara and Sokka then decide to part ways with Aang, but they later change their minds. Meanwhile, Zuko has hired a bounty hunter, June, who tracks down Aang, Katara, and Sokka. It leads to a skirmish. Aang returns Katara's necklace to her after recovering it from Zuko during the fight, and then Katara and Sokka help Aang and resume their collective journey to the North Pole. So that's kind of where we pick up. Episode 16 through 20 will be the ones we cover today. Just to recap what those episodes are, if you don't remember the titles. Episode 16 is The Deserter. Episode 17 is The Northern Air Temple. Episode 18 is The Waterbending Master. And then episode 19 and 20 is a 2-parter, Siege of the North Part 1 and 2. And that concludes Season 1 of Avatar the Last Airbender. So, Tori, go ahead and kick us off into our first category.
Okay, so for TV shows, our first category is for plot, story, and cohesion, including resolution through a season. So out of 2 possible points, I gave this 1.5 points. I think we get some good, for lack of better term, like lessons in these episodes, particularly things that Aang himself learns or has to be exposed to. There's a lot of character growth, I think, that happens in Aang specifically in these 5 episodes. And obviously that starts with episode 16 with the Deserter. Aang has not yet learned the lesson of restraint. And as an Avatar, I think that's a really important and heavy one that he needs to learn, and he has to learn it quickly. We've mentioned this kind of thing previously in some of our other episodes of Avatar that we've talked about, where Aang genuinely has a very short amount of time to learn all of the elemental disciplines, and just the fact that he's also having to learn the state that the world is in is a lot for an Avatar to go through. But so this lesson of restraint almost seems like it would be counterintuitive or counterproductive to the fact that you are on a time crunch, and it's made very evident in episode 16 between the 2 characters of Aang and Zhang that lesson of restraint is foremost the most important thing that Aang needs to know in order to not cause destruction in his, I guess, zealousness or zeal to learn all of these disciplines. It seems like a very almost lofty idea to put in a kid's show, but I think that it's one, especially as you get older, seems a little more important and poignant. Restraint is not something that you as a child think about in any capacity. I think one of the blessings of childhood and having that innocence is that you are not restrained in almost anything, in any like expression or sort of execution of things. Like when you're a kid, you just like give everything, all the energy that you want to put into something. So restraint is kind of something that you have to learn as you get older. So it feels almost like a very mature lesson to be presented at this point in the story. But I think it becomes important, especially as we move into the next few episodes. There's lots of world building that happens in episode 17 of the Northern Air Temple. We've seen the Southern Air Temple earlier in the season, and now we're seeing the Northern Air Temple. And I think that atmosphere is a bit less somber. And most of that has to do with the fact that the Northern Air Temple is still bustling with life. It's not the life that Aang remembers, and so that is a plot point where he sort of has to come to terms with that it may be bustling with life, but it's not the airbenders that he remembers. And so he does come to the realization that he really is the last airbender. But I think because of that, we have sort of a less somber parallel in seeing the Northern Air Temple if we compare that to when we saw the Southern Air Temple, where the Southern Air Temple was very sad and somber and heavy. This one is less all of those things. We also start to get some really interesting backstory, specifically with Katara's family. When you have these moments in the plot, and I think that if you were just watching the show without paying attention, these would be things that don't feel significant, but when you're rewatching or when you're paying very close attention, they sort of make Katara's family feel almost closer to her and Sokka in the moments. So we get to the North Pole, and we're here with all these northern waterbenders. And there's this moment where Katara, obviously, she feels snubbed because the waterbending master won't take her on because of tradition, and she's a girl. And that's something that I could talk about anyway. But my focus here is that, so dejectedly, Katara goes to a healing waterbender, because she's told the women that are waterbenders, this is what they learn. They are just here to learn how to heal using waterbending. So pretty dejectedly, Katara goes and meets this woman. And after the lesson, the woman recognizes and knows the necklace that Katara has, which we have already established in the show that this is a very significant piece of family history. It is a family heirloom that means the world to Katara. And we had a whole sub-arc earlier in the season about how important it was for Katara to get that back. And now she's been reunited with it. Now we're going to get the actual history of that item. It's very significant world building and character building, as well as giving Katara a significant tie to the people in this northern waterbending tribe that I think could be so easily glossed over and should not be. And like I said, it sort of in that moment makes you realize that like the world is not as big as it feels sometimes. And knowing that there are personal ties that these older people have with people that Katara is close with and knows so dearly. I just like when you have a very large world established and then you have these moments where everything feels a little bit closer knit, because then that leads me into my next point, which is now after this happens, we see this allegiance form after Katara fights with the waterbending master, and that whole sort of like subplot, I wouldn't say it necessarily resolves, but sort of comes to like a nice little bookend. We have this allegiance now that we see from the Northern Water Temple with our protagonists just in time to have to band together to fight against a very real threat, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And so now it feels like a natural progression of things. Is if you can have characters make connections with each other, then when it comes time to fight, that allegiance feels more real and more natural and more palpable. And not only that, but you feel the stakes are higher because these people truly care about each other, because you've had these moments where they can make serious emotional connection, or even sometimes that connection is simply what's the word I'm looking for? Not contextual. Circumstantial. Sometimes bonds between characters are strictly circumstantial, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because how many great stories start from the fact that you have people who do not know each other at all, and by the end, they are defending each other's life. And so it is a natural sort of progression, but I like that they don't make all the connections that happen in the North Pole circumstantial. That there are other ties that they bring in, because they could just make it circumstantial and it would still be good. But I think it's even better because now you have, these family connections, these emotional connections, these sentimental connections. And I don't think that it's necessarily bad or cheap to use sentimentality as a reason to connect you with another. Because at the core of everything, media is emotional. And that is how it engages a consumer, is through emotion. So I think when you do it in a smart way that doesn't make your consumer feel stupid for having emotions, it's like the ideal way to do it. And I think that's what you see here. The only reason that I didn't give it full points is because I do think that the deserter episode feels almost misplaced in the story. Just the progression, it feels like it's out of place. Like it maybe should have happened either a little earlier in the season or perhaps after the big climax that we get at the North Pole, because it doesn't really have any bearing on the Northern Air Temple episode, which comes right after it, or the 3 episodes that take place in the North Pole.
Except that Katara finds out about her healing gift.
Okay.
When Aang burns her.
Fair. But
that does tie in. I'm not saying it necessarily had to.
Right.
But it does tie in.
So, but the central plot of that episode is Aang finding a firebending master and now pursuing his learning of firebending, and that central part doesn't really have much bearing on the next 4 episodes. So the only reason I couldn't give it full points, and this is literally me being nitpicky at this point, I will admit, is just that I feel like the episode would have had more weight perhaps in the storytelling if it was just placed differently, whether in this season or next. I just think the placement of the episode is a little wonky. But I think that it's a good high stakes way to finish the season. You bring back all your major characters all in one place. I love that. I think when you get toward the end of a season and you know that you want to kind of have this sort of resolution, even if it's not an overall series resolution, you want to resolve some of the loose ends that you have. And we have these loose ends of Zuko and Iroh and Admiral Zhao. Like, these are all threads that we've started throughout the season. And now we get to see everybody in one place and how those stakes are raised and the real threat and the people that are now, potentially, at risk, and why that matters, and why it matters to our protagonists, and why it matters to our antagonists. And every single one of those things I just mentioned have an explanation in the story. So it's honestly brilliant the way that they kind of bring everybody together in a way that doesn't feel like, why are you here? You know what I mean? So with that being said, 1.5 points out of 2 for plot and story.
Cool. All right, so for plot, story, and cohesion, I also gave this 1.5 points out of 2. I think the pacing in these 4 episodes is really good. None of these episodes feel like they're really draggy or they're kind of like unnecessary or there's like lulls. I think that overall the pacing of the individual episodes are all done really well, and the pacing across the whole arc is really good. I have a couple notes specifically of each kind of little episode, or of each episode as we go. So episode 16, first of all, I think their disguises are horrible. They're the dumbest disguises. That Sokka and Katara are wearing black cloaks and Aang pulls his shirt up over his head. It's just absolutely ridiculous, but I think it's funny. So I think overall this episode has a really good mix of humor with what could be an extremely heavy episode. I mean, this episode 16 and 17 bring into really a lot of complex topics related to war, which is pretty complex for a kids show. You have war crimes, war deserters, with Zhang being the deserter, and that whole process. The other thing about episode 16 I think is really good, and I think it's a nice segue into the final episode, or the season finale, if you will, because it gives you more information about your firebenders as antagonists. I like that firebending is a great skill and an art. It's not just a superpower. Whereas the other bending arts are very artistic in how they're used. Firebending could easily be this like superpower, like a superhero that shoots lasers out of their eyes. I mean, but yet it requires a lot of skill and it requires a lot of restraint. So it really pulls into some background of the techniques that are required to be a firebender. And it also kind of ties way back into when Iroh's instructing Zuko of, firebending comes from the breath and you have to use proper technique. And when he has the Agni Kai with Zhao, it all kind of continues to flesh that out. And the concept that power and destruction, when the power of a firebender is mishandled, and, tying that all together, it's tied up really nicely in that episode. Overall, I think it's done really well. Aang's last fight with Admiral Zhao is just really entertaining. Again, keeping that kind of lightheartedness into what could have been a really heavy episode. Episode 17 has this really interesting theme of progress, which I think is very interesting to explore, not just in a kids show, but in Avatar the Last Airbender as a whole, because we've seen the destruction of the air nomads and the air temple way back episode 2 or 3, and now we are seeing, like, Aang's little analogy is just perfect in that episode, a hermit crab entering a new home. It wasn't the home they were born into, but it was the home that they've made for themselves. I like that. Again, it could have been really dark and really heavy for Aang to react to these huge mechanical changes to what is his home or a familiar home to him. And yet we also see this concept of these new people that are not airbenders, but they have the spirit of an airbender. And so they are taking care of their new home in their own way. And then this concept of progress, Sokka and the machinist, who I believe is unnamed, the way that they are kind of advocating for these new innovations and new concepts. And so you get to see kind of the creativity of non-benders, and then yet you also have this really heavy undertone of this machinist who has succumbed to complying with the enemy in order to protect his family. That, again, could have been a really heavy concept, but it was handled very tastefully. One question I did have with that episode that I think is a pretty significant flaw, if you remember in the Fire Sages Temple, when they want to get into the door so that Aang can talk to Roku, they attempt to get into that room by setting little bombs and simulating 5 firebenders, and it's unsuccessful. And then we see in the air temple, you have this door that only an airbender can open, and when Aang opens it, he finds out that the machinist has been able to get in. And so it's interesting to me,
I didn't think about that. Wow.
The machinist was able to circumvent an airbender only door, and yet we watch that fail in the firebender's temple.
Interesting.
So
I did not think of that.
Yeah, so I was curious where the disconnect was there, because I think
seems
it's
like an oversight, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah. But I think that it's fine. It still works for the plot. But to me, it seems like a pretty big plot hole because we've already established.
It is a plot hole.
Yeah, that you can't circumvent one of those doors.
That it has to be natural creation by a bender.
Right.
Huh.
Yeah.
Interesting. And I did not even think of that.
Yeah. And we don't see any kind of invention or design or way around. You know, was there a trap door in the floor that he tunneled up? You know, we don't see anything like that to give us an answer. Also, I do think it's a little excessive when the Fire Nation army comes to their little settlement and is like, if you don't give us your designs, well, we're going to send our whole army. And they literally send an entire army against a settlement of like maybe 50 people.
I was going to say like 60 people.
Yeah. That just seems really excessive and overdone.
Like you'd think, like I understand that the Fire Nation has been established as oppressive. Right. But it still seems like a waste of soldiers and resources to send that many.
Right. For somebody that is making inventions for your war instruments.
Yeah.
I do really like the concept, though, at the end where you find out that air power is the superiority that the good guys have over the bad guys. And now you have this tension that is not answered by the end of the season of now the firebenders are going to have air power. And it's fire-fueled air power. It's a hot air balloon. So I think that sets up a good tension and an arc for the next upcoming seasons, especially when this overarching war is the ultimate conflict of the show. So I like that they've tied that in to the big concept in addition to resolving that very small plot. Episode 18 is actually an episode I'm not a big fan of. I do like that we finally get introduced into the North Pole, the Water Tribe. You know, I think all of the world building of the North Pole is just done really, really well. But the overall plot, I'm really not a fan of. I like that they arrive at their goal and it isn't what they expected. It's not this huge, big, wonderful, warming welcome party with, you know, sunshine and roses. And, you know, now they have this imminent threat of the Fire Nation coming to the North Pole. But I think the plot with Zuko and Iroh, that B plot when the pirates come back and, you know, they kind of fake Zuko's death there. I like that plot more than I like the main plot with Katara and Aang trying to learn waterbending and Master Pakku not teaching them. Mm-hmm. I think my biggest problem with this episode is I do, like you said, I like that Katara's necklace and the fact that they have waterbending as a healing art and all of that. I really like all of that. I like the introduction of the chief and Yue and their whole culture. I do think it really fleshes out the Water Tribe as a nation and a culture and a tradition. But I do have a problem with the fact that Master Pakku won't teach Katara because she's a girl, because it goes against their traditions in the Northern Water Tribe. And that he's very adamant about that. You know, it's how many years of tradition and you're disrespecting our culture, disrespecting our tradition. How dare you? And then, you know, conceptually, all of the women who are waterbenders have been disbarred from becoming, you know, waterbenders with, you know, learning attacking,
like fighting
style. And then it's like the ultimate, like, whoops, guess I'll just change my mind. And the ultimate form of nepotism when Pakku is like, oh, you have the necklace of my former betrothed. Okay, I guess I'll teach you.
Yeah.
It's like, are you kidding me? Like, you're so adamant that this is upsetting years of tradition. It would have made so much more sense if he was the only waterbender teacher available because everybody else was off at war. He's the only one left and he's still training the new students, but it's his choice. Not the years of tradition, not the respect to their culture. It's just his personal choice to not teach women waterbenders. And that everybody else is just like, well, all of our female waterbenders, they're not allowed to teach. They're not qualified. You know, you don't have anybody else. He's your only option. And then he changes his mind versus, wow, okay, you've just rewritten all of our traditions. We're just throwing them all out the window because of one person, because he was sweet on your grandma.
Right. So what would have been more interesting is for him to realize that, okay, Katara is descendant of the woman he used to love. And now he's got an internal conflict. Do I listen to what she's saying and realize that perhaps the reason that my betrothed did leave is because she wanted to waterbend and tradition would not allow her. So now he's got this internal conflict between tradition and love. That would have been more interesting to see fleshed out more.
Right.
And now he has to make a decision after true contemplation, you know, what is more important, and then having that explored a little bit more instead of just like okay, you know,
right.
Right, yeah.
Or if that conflict arced over multiple episodes
Right.
and we got to see it explored more.
If he got backlash for then allowing Katara in, you know, something like that would have been more interesting. Right.
So overall, I think it was just a little too like kitschy, like chintzy, like a little kid show. It didn't to me seem on par with other Avatar the Last Airbender episodes.
It seemed like too much of a conflict for not enough of a resolution.
Yeah.
Like the resolution was too simple for the problem at hand.
Right. So. And it was the plot of half the episode because the other half was the B plot with Zuko and Iroh.
Yeah.
So
and then the small bit between Sokka and Yue.
Right. So it was an extremely short plot line that seemed to have this big cataclysmic change in an entire tribe's centuries of tradition. Yeah. So it just seemed a little unfulfilling for me. So that's one reason I'm not a huge fan of that episode, but I do like all the other little tie-ins that thread through from prior to the end of the season. Episode 19 and 20 I think are great. I really do think they're really well done episodes. The invasion plot is really good. Again, we have this kind of concept of war. It's really more of a war coming to the Water Tribe, and it's a war against an entire nation because we've already learned that the Southern Water Tribe is pretty much non-existent. So these are the last waterbenders left that are not away trying to fight the Fire Nation. These are the only waterbenders that are left. And now the Fire Nation is going full throttle against this entire nation. I think the fire and ice concept of battle is really good. Fire and ice and fire and water are completely different opponents. And then you find out that in all of this, Zhao as your villain and the Fire Nation attacking the Water Tribe is not just them trying to attack the Water Nation. Zhao's ulterior motive to actually kill the Moon Spirit is just phenomenal.
I know.
I think it's a great plot.
It's like just when you thought this dude was evil, like now he's even eviler.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it also helps validate the way that Aang is the link between the physical and the spiritual world. We now see that has more than just of an effect on during a solstice, like we saw in the summer solstice episode with Heibai. You know, okay, Aang is fighting the bad spirits causing problems, but now here we have humans causing risk to spirits that are going to upset the balance of the entire world. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a great concept. And then Aang going into the spirit world and that whole plot line I think is really good because it's more than just Aang fighting with airbending. He's saving more than just a nation of people. He's saving the moon spirit, which is going to then save life on the planet as a whole because you can't live without the moon. The fact that waterbending is stronger with the moon helps ground bending into the elements of the world around it rather than those innate superpowers. So kind of like back into that episode with Zhang, it's not just superpower, you're just blasting fire everywhere. The waterbending is now tied to the natural world with it being stronger in the moon and then during the day. I think it's just a really good part of the world building. One little plot point I also noticed with this, though, was, you know, Zuko captures Aang, which I think is a great plot point. He finally captures the Avatar, and that whole part with him escaping and it's just done really well. Iroh's compassion for him in that scene is just so good. But you have this whole thing where Aang's setting up to go into the spirit world and Katara says, we just can't move his body. We can't move his body. And then we find out literally in the next episode
that that Aang's spirit just goes.
It made no difference if his body was moved.
So they could have been like, oh shoot, it's Zuko. Let's grab Aang.
Right.
You know?
Right. So they literally contradicted themselves in the span of like 10 minutes. And I'm like, well, I guess we could have thought that through a little bit more. But yeah, overall, the writing is done really good. The dialogue is written really well. They've thought through a lot of the plot to set up this climactic end. And then I do think they're even clever with a little bit of foreshadowing when Aang says that, maybe, we can talk to the spirits and they can unleash a crazy spirit attack. And they do. That's how they win. Like, it's the ocean spirit that actually defeats the Fire Nation and defeats Zhao. And so I think even having Aang not being the one that destroys the Fire Nation's army, but actually it's the moon spirit that uses Aang because he is the avatar. I just think that was just done really well and really tastefully, because then Aang still has room to grow as a character, because he's not the one that just defeated this whole huge adversary. He still has more to grow and more to learn, because he can't just do that on the Fire Lord. So I think it was really smart to set up the end of a really good season and yet still give your characters a lot more room to grow and change in the upcoming seasons. So 1.5 points out of 2 for me.
Okay. So moving on to our next category of characters, that's a possible 3 points, and I gave it 2.5 points. I think we see a bunch of really interesting new characters. Even if they're characters that are only present for an episode or 2 or maybe 3 max, we have some really, really interesting ones. So let's talk about Zhong at first. The idea of him being a war deserter, basically shunned by his people, and now living basically in hiding, is super interesting, especially because we meet him. He's very gruff. He's very bitter. He's got some anger, and yet he is still adamant with Aang about the fact that Aang cannot let the fire get the better of him. The things he says to Aang almost go against his personality, but I find it interesting rather than contradictory, because you look at this man and you imagine, just in the few bits of backstory that you get on him, you look at this man and you imagine all that he has gone through and the choices that he has made, and he has stayed true to the choices that he's made, knowing the consequences that would come for it. And you build a respect for this man, despite the fact that he's not nice. He's not a nice man, but yet he knows more than these children know, and he's terrified. While he doesn't say it, he's terrified that the destruction of fire is going to ruin the world, because he saw it firsthand. And so for a firebender to almost be afraid of the fire is crazy to me, but it's such a good character choice. And it makes you really want to see him again by the end of the episode. I also think it's really interesting. Zhong has this moment, and he talks about the 4 elements, and he describes those 4 elements, right? And the way he does it, it almost makes those elements feel like characters of their own, because he gives them personalities. And we kind of talked about that in a previous episode, how each element does seem to have its own characteristics. But the way that Zhong talks about them, he almost talks about, it's funny, he talks about water, earth, and air almost with like a sense of fondness. And then he talks about fire like it should be avoided at all costs. And he is a firebender, not just a firebender, but a fire master. And it's just such an interesting piece of dialogue. Like, just that whole scene is just incredibly deep, maybe not surface, but like, I think it's one of those scenes that's better on a rewatch, because you're now seeing the implications of what he's saying, and how Aang is sitting there like, okay, that's nice, but can we get started? Because to Aang, he hasn't seen the starkness of the negativity that fire has in the whole world. everybody's looking on fire negatively. And Aang isn't quite there. Like, he knows the Fire Nation is his enemy, and he knows that he's learning now that their oppression has harmed the whole world. But the element...
But he doesn't really understand that, because
Correct.
his only... Like, he even tells Zuko when he, in the Blue Spirit episode, he says, I had friends that were in the Fire Nation.
Right.
Like, we all got along. His only point of reference is the fact that they wiped out his people, which, of course, is extremely painful and is really all you would need to know that this is dangerous. But I'm sure for Aang, he doesn't see it as the element being the problem.
And that's my point, is that the way that Zhang talks about the element of fire is nothing but in negatives. And then he talks about the other three elements like they are so great and healing, and they bring life and foundation and steadfastness and, you know, all the words that he uses to describe the other three elements. And then he's like, and fire will hurt you and everyone you love. And it's like, sheesh, you know, and then I'm sitting here watching this going, Aang, why are you not taking any note of this? But it's just because all Aang wants is, oh, fire, cool, I'm gonna shoot it out of my hands. And then we see that come to fruition later with Aang's flippancy and his lack of restraint, and he ends up harming Katara from it. And it's exactly what Zhang said. And everything just... So anyway, Zhang's a cool character. I feel like I'm starting to tangent now, but he's a cool character, and he's got a lot of nuance. He's probably one of the more nuanced characters that we see, especially for the fact that we only see him in one episode. So it's like, okay, this guy he's literally episode of the week, man. And he's way more nuanced than a lot of the characters that we've seen come and go so far. So I really like Zhang. He's really cool.
I think he's a great character.
He is. The next character I want to talk about is Teo. So Teo is a really neat character. Okay, so Teo, I think it's really neat to see a character that has a physical limitation shown in the Avatar world, and to see how they deal with that in a way that makes sense to the world. And his wheelchair is not what we would traditionally see in our day and age as a wheelchair, which is all plastic and metal. But his wheelchair makes sense for the world. And, you know, obviously it's kind of a vague time period, but it obviously takes place in a past, you know, a version of the past. So to see, you know, the wood and the straw, you know, made into this wheelchair, I thought was really neat. But not only that, another thing I love about that whole, or about Teo, is that he's not just his wheelchair. That he is a kid with a fiery spirit and no fear. He's super brave. And, you know, by the end of it, he and Aang are playing around with each other. Aang is a literal airbender, and he is being shown up by this kid in a wheelchair on, you know, in the air on this glider. And it's just like a really cool thing that, you know, they showed that this character, you know, he's got this bright, bubbly personality, you know, and he brings a lot of life to this little village, which you later find out were refugees, descended from refugees, and they came to the Northern Air Temple after it was abandoned simply to have a safe place to live, which, you know, is crazy when you think about it. So I think Teo is a really cool character, and it's cool to see how they handled it, and not in any way that I found demeaning. And, you know, I can only say so much because I do not have any physical limitations, but from my perspective, I feel like he's just such a like bubbly, beautiful character, and it just makes sense. He's not just like every other character of the week that we've seen come and go. You know, he's got something very distinct about him, but it's not ever viewed or talked about as a negative, and the protagonist never even like feel the need to, like, you know, bring up the fact that, you know, he's in a wheelchair, because it's not important to his I guess
his identity.
Yeah,
really.
His identity.
Yeah,
it's really
I made
not.
note of that too, is that I really appreciate the fact that it bothers me when, especially children's shows, but any media has your token whatever character, but especially when it's somebody with a disability, or somebody with a limitation. Your token blind person, the only thing they're there for is to remind you that they're blind.
Yeah.
Your token person in a wheelchair is just there to remind you that they're in a wheelchair. And that's their whole character identity is I'm in a wheelchair and I have no other personality.
And that's insulting to people in the real world that have these sort of challenges, because they're like, cool. I feel like sometimes they put those people in for representation, but they're actually not representing.
Right, because they're not a human being.
Yeah, they're flat and boring, or literally they just come in to mix up the group.
It's like, what if we did that with every character who had glasses? Their only character quality was I wear glasses.
Exactly. And it is insulting.
It is.
And so it's a breath of fresh air to see a character that is fun and bubbly and important to the plot and people, and drives the story forward in that episode, and they just also happen to be in a wheelchair.
Yeah, and
thank you.
And
for
literally
that.
Nobody even mentions it because it's not important.
I think his father mentions very briefly that when he was a very young baby, he was injured.
Yes.
I think it's the only thing we get.
But nobody is like, wow, that kid is in a wheelchair and he's just as much of an airbender as I am. It's like, not even said. It's about...
like, dude, you are so cool on that glider. Because he is. And it has nothing to do with the fact that he's in a wheelchair.
Right.
So Teo is a really good character. And then Yue is another, obviously you get, Master, what's his name? Paku. And, the chief or whatever he is. He's not exactly a king.
He's a chief.
Chief.
Yeah, I think they mention that Yue is the chief's daughter.
Yeah. But Yue is a very interesting character. I think she is a little bit flat. I don't think it's necessarily her fault. However, her connection to the moon spirit is really what makes her interesting, and makes her much more valuable, I think, and the stakes surrounding her feel a lot more natural. Because it is a very interesting thing to kind of be like, I was born very sickly, and the only reason I am here today is because the moon spirit took pity on me. So it's a very unusual story, and makes the stakes feel even higher because when Zhao, who I will talk about in a second, comes in and wants to kill the moon spirit, we now know that not only throws the entire world off of balance, but that's directly tied to Yue's life. So, it's an interesting sort of choice that they made. It's not something I expected the first time I watched the show, so it was kind of like one of those whoa moments. And I think it's handled very well. But let me talk about Zhao for a second. Zhao is very scary. And the biggest reason that he is very scary is because he is very smart. And a smart villain is terrifying. And when your villains have a villain, that's pretty scary. Zhao is an impeccably easy to hate evil villain. And he, sends shivers down my spine, and he makes me grit my teeth and clench my fists, and that is exactly what you want from a villain. And the villainous things that he does, he's not... Yes, he is reckless in some ways, but it's not like he's a villain that just walks through crowds and, slices people with his sword. He's a very calculating villain, and he makes this plan, and he makes a backup plan, and he makes a cover story, and all of these things, he puts all of the puzzle pieces in perfect place so that he can go in easily, accomplish his goal, and then step out feeling accomplished and prideful. And those sorts of villains are the scariest ones. So Zhao is very scary. And I think because of that, it really brings the climax of the season to, pun maybe intended, boiling point, because now we see that his intention is not only to take over other tribes, but to throw the world into catastrophic destruction. The moment that Iroh literally is like, stop, Like, you must put the moon spirit back. And he says, if you harm the moon, I'm paraphrasing because I can't remember the line exactly, but he's like, if you harm the moon spirit, I will unleash on you tenfold. These are people supposed to be on the same team here. And Iroh recognizes that the action that Zhao is about to take is not just going to hurt the Fire Nation's enemies, it will hurt everyone. And Zhao is perfectly and fully aware of this and still willing to do it. And that is spooky, okay? So Zhao is very scary. He's a great character, though. I love Iroh and the way that he loves Zuko. And we've seen it from the beginning, but just every time we have these moments, you know, when Zuko's leaving and he's like, okay, like, I'm about to go do what I gotta do. And Iroh, you know, he's almost like, in a way,
he's like your mom when you leave the house.
He's like, oh, did you pack your gloves? Did you bring some water to drink? You know, make sure you rest when you get tired. And like,
don't forget to put your hood up. It gets cold.
Yeah. And it's like, okay, thanks. You know, like when you're 12 and watching this show, you're like, Iroh's silly. And like now I'm 30 years old and I watch this show and all I can think is Iroh loves Zuko more than anybody else in this entire world loves Zuko. Literally. Nobody cares for Zuko the way that Iroh does. And you see those moments just in the way that he speaks to him. And he speaks to him. Zuko can be so disrespectful sometimes because he is so angry and bitter and hurt. And Iroh takes every single bitter word that Zuko slings at him and he just throws it behind himself and he loves him anyway. And their dynamic, this is why Uncle Iroh is my favorite character, okay? Because their dynamic is so wonderfully, like, admirable. And Iroh is the kind of man that he is not in any way a weak man. We see that in multiple occasions. I mean, even his confrontation with Zhao proves Iroh is not a weak man, but he has tenderness in him that he exudes all the time towards Zuko, and he exudes in other ways too. Like, it's not just towards Zuko, but he has a tenderness within him that in turn makes him a more stable person emotionally all the time. Through the entire series, Iroh is one of the most emotionally stable characters. And because of that, I think he is such a nice anchor through the whole show, especially surrounding Zuko, but in other ways and with other characters, you know, and if you think about like the whole like Fire Lord family, like his relation with all of them, Iroh just becomes, he's just such an anchor through the show. And moments like this that you see with Zuko are just like big green flags, honestly, for lack of, you know, better term. He's just a good man, and you get to see moments of that. So I love Iroh, and I just wanted to talk about him for a moment. The Face Stealer, scary, also very scary. I don't think I could have done what Aang does, which is go in and show no emotion, because especially for some reason the baboon face is like the freakiest one to me. But imagine like going in, you're having a conversation with this spirit. The spirit knows how to basically get a rise out of people. Like, that's the whole purpose of the Face Stealer. So just the idea that like, if this spirit succeeds in any way getting a rise out of you, like, your face is stolen, like, that's scary. And when I was young, it was very scary to me. So we get some like really kind of scary moments, I think, in these last few episodes, you know, these last 5 episodes of season 1. The only reason I didn't give it full points is Yue is a little bit flat, and I don't particularly love the love triangle thing that they do with Sokka and the other boy whose name I don't even remember. Han. Okay. So with Han and Sokka and Yue, it's a little bit weird. I think, okay, it does have some plot significance, so I'll give it that. But I found it real. I didn't think about this years ago, but I thought about it this time. It's a little odd that Yue kisses Sokka and then tells him that she's engaged. It just seems a little wrong to me. And so because of that, it gave me a little bit of an ick that I'd never really previously had. And like, I get it, you know, you don't love Han and he probably doesn't really love you and it's all honor bound or whatever. But like, if you're gonna be honor bound, you should probably commit to that and not go kissing other dudes. That's just my personal opinion. So it gave me a little bit of like this time watching it. So I was like, I don't think I can give it full points. Also, I think that, I don't know if it's just me, but in a few of these episodes, I feel like Sokka's consistent humor is a little off. Like, he's just not as funny in these episodes. And maybe it's just because the focus is not there and we don't need him to liven up things as much. Or these are not among the sillier episodes. But the humor just seemed a little bit off to me. So I don't know. But all of that to say, I took half a point off for those things. So 2.5 points out of 3.
Alrighty, well, I also gave it 2.5 points out of 3 for characters. Aang, I think, has the most growth. Wow. Aang, I think, has the most growth in some of these episodes, especially episode 16. We watch this change in Aang as he learns from Zhang Zhang and then has his negative experience with firebending. He comes into that episode with his typical reckless, carefree airbender attitude that, you know, it's whatever, it'll all just work out. Like, it's fine. We'll figure it out. It'll all work out. Don't think about it so hard. Don't worry about it. You worry too much. You think too much. Well, it'll be fine. And then he realizes how having that attitude can have consequences. And I think that's a lot of growth for Aang, because up until that point, we've seen Aang have this attitude that it's fine, it's going to work out. And it does pretty much every time. It works out just fine for him. And now that's his attitude with firebending. And he's so resistant to training diligently that it has consequences, and it causes him to do exactly what Zhang Zhang warned about, and he hurts somebody he loves and hurts somebody he cares about. And fortunately, there's no dire consequences from that, but then Aang also gets to see the dire consequences that Zhao experiences with his lack of restraint. And so I think it's handled very well in the plot of that episode, but I think it's really good that we see Aang fail, and we see him fail because of his choices, not because of his circumstances. And I think that shows a lot of growth in Aang over that episode. And in a way, we see him carry that into the rest of the season. But he also has growth in the episode following with the Air Temple, the Northern Air Temple. He's very resistant to these people that have infiltrated his home and are living there, which it's not his home. It's not the air temple he grew up in, but it's his people's home. And we see Aang kind of soften and realize that these are people with lives that need a new home and that they're taking care of it in their own way. And it's not the way that an airbender would, but it's with the same care of each other that airbenders had. And I think that's a lot of maturity for Aang too, whereas he would either have the attitude that, you know, like he has at the beginning, that this is horrible, I don't like these people, they're destroying stuff that's sacred, and or that he just has this still happy-go-lucky attitude and it doesn't affect him at all. So I think Aang has a lot of growth. And then of course, you know, with his whole interaction with the spirit world and learning to waterbend, all of that is a lot more external factors that affect him, but I still think we see him consistently act in character in that, you know, he's fearless when he goes into the spirit world, and then he's fearless when it comes to fighting off the Fire Nation. When he goes to attack all those ships, he very much does it in his own airbender style. So we see a lot of consistency in Aang's character, and yet we still see growth in these episodes as well. Katara, her healing abilities are great. I think it's a great integration of her. Just gives her more depth, and I hate to say utility, but it really does give her a good new skill to use, and it's interesting to see how she's going to use that in the future. I think that just the fact that they have her, they show a lot of bravery in Katara in these episodes. She's brave. She decides to hang glide. She's not an airbender. She has not done it before. It could go horribly wrong, but she does it anyway. She stands up to Paku and challenges him to waterbending fight when she barely knows how to waterbend. And she's extremely courageous and willing to stand for what she believes in. And then we see in episodes 19 and 20, she surpasses Aang in her skill, and she's called Master Katara by the end of the show, or of the season. So here we see Katara has a lot of bravery and commitment, and her waterbending skill moves beyond what Aang is capable of, which I think is it's great for plot, but it's also just shows a lot of her character.
It's interesting to see the two of them trying to learn disciplines together, because you do see the comparison that Katara is a very disciplined bender, while Aang has to work on that quite often.
Right. I like Sokka, that you see this moment in episode 17 with the Northern Air Temple where he connects with Teo's dad, and you get to see his inventions, his creativity, how they come up with a way to detect the natural gas, how they come up with a way to create the hot air balloon, get the hot air balloon to work. And so you see this innovation that Sokka has in this episode, and I really like that. In addition to the fact that he brings his knowledge and skill and his intellect into the fight against the Fire Nation with the Northern Water Tribe, when, the Fire Nation's uniforms don't look like that anymore. And, he has this strong sense of he still has that innate desire to protect others, whether he wants to protect Yue, he wants to protect, he wants to go on the mission with Han, and he wants to fight and defend, the Water Tribe. And so they keep that consistent as well. I didn't think his humor was too off, although he doesn't have as much of it in episodes 19 and 20. But I do think that in 16 and 17 and some of 18, he is the kind of comedic relief. Mm-hmm. So even though he may not have the humor coming out of his mouth, he is in comedic situations that I think are used very well. But I think that we're watching those episodes kind of narrow into a more serious tone. Yeah. So I think it kind of fits. But I do see what you're saying. He's not as quick-witted and witty. Iroh and Zuko, you touched a lot about Iroh and Zuko, and so I won't, a lot of what I had notes on you've already said, so I won't go rehash those, but I did want to say the part where you see how much Iroh cares for Zuko, and this is the episode where you finally find out why. And I think that dialogue between the two, it's 3 lines, but it's so good, because Iroh admits that Zuko is basically his surrogate son, because Iroh has lost his son, and he sees Zuko as his own. And the part that I think is so poignant is that Zuko knows it. Mm-hmm. And Zuko says to him, it's okay, you don't have to say it. Because he already knows that that's how Iroh feels about him. And I think that it's very integral to those two characters and to their relationship for us as viewers to know that. But it's also, I think it shows even more depth in Iroh, because he's aware that Zuko knows why he cares. And when you see the way Zuko treats Iroh so poorly, and you're like, he's like you're like a son to him, and you're treating him this way. But it's like Iroh even knows that Zuko has so much pain, he can't reciprocate and even receive that status because he has so much pain that he's working through.
And it's interesting too to note that Zuko does know how Iroh feels about him, but he probably feels this weird it's almost like a strange parallel, because he has these 2 father figures in his life, and one he could try as hard as possible every day of his life, and he may not still get the approval of his actual father, and yet he can slip up and hurt Iroh every day, and Iroh still loves him the same. Yeah. So for Zuko, that's probably a strange thing to navigate too.
Right.
Is that I have this man who's my uncle, not actually my father, but treats me more like a father than my actual father ever would or ever will. And I think there's a part of Zuko that knows he will never have the full approval of his father, but yet he's still going to aim for it anyway. It's his entire motivation, you know, the entire goal is of him capturing the Avatar is for his honor, for his place back at home. And yet there is such a strange contrasting parallel between those two men.
Yeah. And I think we get to see that in a very unique way. The way that Iroh, you know, his reaction to Zuko's alleged death when the pirates blow up the ship, and then his willingness to join Zhao so that Zuko can sneak on board, so that Zuko can still pursue the goal that he set out to do, and then Iroh's stance against Zhao in favor of keeping the balance with the moon spirit. All of that is just so good. We really see a lot of depth in these characters. And I think it's just done really tastefully without detracting from the main story and without making Zuko and Iroh, they are not sympathetic villains. We haven't excused any of their behavior. We haven't given them a pass on, you know, their decision to hunt Aang and track him down. And, you know, we've never excused any of the poor decisions they've made. We've just given them more depth as to why they are the way they are. Zhao, I agree, he's a very scary villain. The fact that we see his vulnerability of he is his own worst enemy in episode 16 is so interesting. And then yet we still see this ruthless war villain who's willing to not just capture Aang and not just kill the moon spirit, which is pretty horrible, like you said, I agree, but he's also willing to commit genocide again and wipe out the water tribe completely. Like, that's his goal, is to eliminate the water tribe and then also kill the moon spirit, which is a horrible idea. But here you have a villain who is so evil in every way. There's no redeeming quality of him. And I think it was just so great to keep your villain consistently villainous.
Yeah.
And I do like that one moment we have where he sees, like you're talking about his intelligence, he sees the swords on Zuko's wall and immediately connects it. He immediately connects it.
Yeah.
So
I think Zuko realizes he figures it out.
He does.
But it's like, you can't say anything
right
at that moment.
Right. Exactly. You pretty much touched on everything that I had about Zhang Zhang. I think it's good that he fills this mentor role for Aang. And then in episode 18, Pakku now fills this kind of mentor role, but he's not the mentor that you would really want because he's so antagonistic against Aang. I mostly took off half a point because of Pakku's quick change decision, how he's so adamant and so grounded in what he believes, and then in less than 30 seconds he completely changes his mind. I really don't like that aspect of it. And then Yue as well, as another reason that I didn't give this full points. I think that, you know, that was one heck of a kiss to someone you hardly know when you're engaged to somebody else.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that, one, she hardly knows Sokka at all. And, I mean, to Sokka's fault, too. Like, they don't know each other. They've known each other one day. One day. Mm-hmm. And now they're, like, madly in love, and she's kissing him on a bridge, and, oh, I can't be with you, I'm engaged, ah! Yeah. And now we have this horrible, like, love triangle that's not horrible because Han is so dumb, like... It's just So that whole plot line I really didn't like as a plot point, but then also just as a character. But Yue does kind of redeem herself because she sacrifices her life to save the moon spirit. So I think that she does have a redemptive ending. But then also one character I'll touch on and then we'll move on is Ko, the face stealer, is such a good character. He's so good. We finally have an aspect of the spirit world that is terrifying, and yet he's this very interesting character because here he has no stake in the game. He has no incentive to help Aang. He has no incentive to not help Aang. He is just completely neutral party, and yet Aang goes to him for help, and he gives him the information he needs. But then does he also have this ulterior motive that his goal is to add a face to his collection? Yeah, he says that flat out. Like, I haven't had a child's face in a long time. I mean, scary, scary guy. And yet he still gives Aang the information he wants. He helps him save the moon spirit. He's cryptic about it. But it's like, is this guy a villain or not? We don't really know. And yet it just stays really interesting. And I just think it's a great way to kind of further build the world of the spirit world of Avatar the Last Airbender. In addition to Heibai and the moon spirit, now we have Ko. So those are the three spirits we have as context for what does it mean to be the bridge between the physical world and the spiritual world. So all of that to say, I think the characters in these episodes are done really well, but there's a couple flaws. I think that's why I gave it 2.5 points out of 3.
Okay, so our next category is aesthetics. Out of 2 points, I gave it 1.5 points. Just a couple nitpicky things that I'll get to at the end. I'm actually going to talk about the things I like first. So the lighting in the Deserter is gorgeous.
It is really good.
All of the beautiful reflections. There's a nighttime camp, bonfire scene, and you got the lovely blue-gray shadows from the moon contrasted against the orangey red reflection of the bonfire is just beautiful for animation. And then not only that, but we get a lot of that sort of flickery firelight in Zhang Zhang's tent, which is very dark with the exception of these candles that are around him in a semicircle, and you see the constantly moving, flickering light, which is very realistic and probably very hard to recreate in animation, I would assume. I'm not an animator, but it seems like something that could be difficult to get just right, and I feel like they get it just right. And then you have moments later on in the same episode when Zhang Zhang puts up the big wall of fire to try to slow down the warships and Zhao comes through it. If you watch the shadows of it on Zhao's face as he breaks through, it's impeccable. Just the use of shadow is done in such a smart way in that episode. I just really, really love it. We also see a lot of, and I don't know if this is also kind of like a storytelling or maybe character choice, but a lot of times when Aang is talking to Zhang Zhang, and then it happens again with Zhao in that episode, fire is literally reflected. Mm-hmm. It's almost like a way to signify, obviously it is actual fire that is being reflected, like it is a natural reflection, but it also gives the indication that there's almost like a fire in the spirit of these men. And I just thought it was a nice touch to do aesthetically that sort of just nails home, the passion, I guess, within, or the motivation within these men. So I thought that was a really cool situation. I don't have a lot to say aesthetically about the Northern Air Temple episode. I do think that... I do have a note, but I'm going to save it for the end. But as far as everything else goes, it just sort of seems like just an episode that fits nicely in the world. So that's kind of the normal thing. But when we get to the Northern Water Tribe, we get to the North Pole here, and we have this very elegant sort of creation and map of this city. With the waterways and the gate, the way the gate opens up is just crazy. And you're like, wow, this is gorgeous and perfect and pristine. And there's the pretty temple looking thing in the back. I don't know what all the terms are that they have for the things, but the design, the mapping of the North Pole is really, really lovely and cool. And it feels like a very well thought out and established people. And sure, they may be really the only significant group of waterbenders in the world, but they're not as large as they seem at first glance. It's a very grandiose sort of place, and then you get there and you're like, there's really not that many people in here. And so it's almost like a strange I guess comparison when you see all the huge walls and waterfalls and arches and things, and then you're like, but this place by comparison is kind of empty. And it's a strange sort of storytelling tactic, I think. The water bending, especially with Katara, but water bending starts to appear smoother and smoother. And I'm sure part of it is that Katara is getting better at water bending. But even when we see the other benders, especially in the North Pole, the animation itself of the water, and this is the first time we've ever seen like a water versus water combat, so that's very interesting to see. And I think the way that they animate it is very nice because it's still easy to track whose water is whose. And I don't know how they did that, but it's almost like when you have like Katara and Paku, it's like their water, while still just being water, takes on the personality of the bender as well. So it's still distinct enough that you can tell what is Katara's and what is Paku's. And somehow the way they animate that, I don't know how, I can't articulate that to you, but it's just very distinct, and I like that sort of thing. And because of that, it feels so natural. It feels so smooth. They do a lot, especially in the last episode, they do a lot of like these overall full color palette switches. So there's a color shift when Zhao takes the moon spirit and everything goes into like black and white.
It's red.
Or red. It goes red first. Yeah. And it's so crazy to see everything that has been bathed in sort of these like milky blues and whites and silvers and creams is now awash in this very violent sort of red. And then it shifts again when the moon dims. So then we go to like all gray. Now and it's dark grays too. It's like dark grays and blacks. It's very scary, very heavy feeling. And then we get a third color swap when Aang becomes like the big, large water spirit. I don't know if it's supposed to be reminiscent of the moon spirit that has just been taken.
No, it's the water spirit.
Okay, so the water spirit. So
the ocean spirit.
Yeah, so he embodies the ocean spirit, and we get yet another color palette switch, and it's like these. Now instead of like the dreamy blues and whites, it's like stark, almost electric blues and those sorts of things. And I just find it so interesting that they chose to do these overall palette swaps and not just like a few motif items or props, but these overall palette swaps are just such an interesting choice creatively that I really liked. The reason I didn't give it full points though is in episode 17, we have, this tiny little village at the air temple, and they're fighting these Fire Nation armies, which, obviously they're quite outnumbered. And the CGI of the, tanks that come in is so weird. And it's like the frames per second or something is different because they feel like they don't... I don't want to say they feel jerky, but it's almost like the way they move doesn't flow with like the rest of the animation. And I understand that it's like CG, like part of this is CG, but it's so starkly different that all I kept thinking was like, why does it feel like the ships are moving in slow motion and everything else around them is moving at like normal speed? So something about it didn't seem to like match up, and I couldn't figure out what it was, but I didn't like it very much. And it was so stark to me that it distracted me for like 5 minutes of that episode. And I just kept looking at these weird CG tanks like, what is going on here? So because of that, I just couldn't, it was just such a big flaw in my eyes, because it was not seamless in my opinion. That's why I ended up with 1.5 points out of 2.
Okay, well, I think that I've consistently scored this, but I gave it 2 points out of 2. I think every Avatar scoring we've done, I think I've given them 2 out of 2. And it's usually for different reasons, but yeah, I really don't have any negatives to say. I did not experience that, what you're describing with the tanks. They are CGI from what I can tell, but for me, they didn't look like they weren't smooth. There are parts of the tanks where I feel like they have spiked wheels, and so they're those spikes are cutting into the landscape, and then it's moving forward on the wheel. So maybe that's what was a distraction for you, was that movement. But I didn't really find it distracting. Just couple notes I have specific to each episode. In 16, we have the first depiction of a Fire Nation village. Technically, we do see very briefly in flashback scenes a Fire Nation village in the episode with Jet, but this is the first time we see inhabitants of a Fire Nation village with Fire Nation garb in a Fire Nation festivities, and it's just done really, really well. It feels unique to the Fire Nation rather than an Earth Nation colony or the Water Tribe or the Air Temple. It just feels very unique to the Fire Nation itself, and I just thought it was done really, really well. The clothing's developed, the festivities, the food, it all just feels really unique. In episode 17 with the Air Temple, I really like all of those changes that have occurred kind of quote unquote with the times. The very industrial piping that goes everywhere, which makes sense for this machinist who then we find out is also making war machines for the Fire Nation. So of course he would be using those metallic, metal, industrial equipment in revitalizing this temple, because that's the way the Fire Nation operates. They're that metal, metallic infrastructure. So it seems odd when we first see it, but then once we know that, oh yeah, by the way, he's a machinist who's working for the Fire Nation, well, of course you would have piping and steam and you know, all of those aspects that are used by the Fire Nation. We've seen them in their ships when Aang's on the ship, and you know, so it's an interesting continuity that we don't really know until we find out who this guy's actually working for. The 18 through 20, so once they're in the North Pole, the visuals just are so rich. They've really fleshed out this culture of the North Pole, the Northern Water Tribe. The costumes that all the characters wear throughout these episodes are great, but then I've also seen this unique armor, the ceremonial looking garb, the food, the way the food looks when they're having their banquet. All of it just looks really, really unique. And then kind of like you already touched on those color palettes at the end in that climactic battle. And that's another thing that I really, really like. That red, you know, from the red to the gray to the black to that vivid blue is just such good storytelling. And I think that alone is just, it's really unique to a kid's film. It's a very artistic choice. And the spirit world, I like how the spirit world has this kind of these earthy beige tones that almost have like a smoky film over them, like we're not really there, it's not really tangible and physical. And then the creature design in the spirit world is just so great. That first monkey character we see who talks to Aang, and then we see Hey Bye, and then we see Ko. And Ko's creature design, I think his design alone would get 2 out of 2 points. It would carry the weight of this category, in my opinion. It's just, he's such a well-designed character. He's the right amount of creepy. He doesn't feel like he's from the physical world, the natural world. The way that he has these different faces and he changes them with this sort of a blink effect that just changes these different faces, and how he changes his face, and then the way that his voice changes, but yet it doesn't change. It's all designed so well. It's just such a good design. And the fact that he's kind of this centipede-esque body and he can climb on the wall and upside down, it just gives you this eerie, like, creepy feeling, like you need to go, like, make sure you don't have a bug on your shoulder when you're done watching it, just because it just feels wrong and unnatural, yet it fits the spirit world so well. And you also can feel like this guy really is the oldest spirit that would know who the moon and ocean spirits are, and you feel that he would know the ocean and moon spirit, and he fits their world. Even though not they're in the physical world and are koi fish in the form of a koi fish, he would know them and have it all fits really well aesthetically. And I feel like it could have gone really, really wrong really easily if they made him this, like, the characters in the spirit world, these, like, amorphous, blob-like ghost characters, or even if it was, like, in the, is it Princess Mononoke with the little spirit guys that have the big eyes, and the
forest spirit things.
Like the Ghibli versions of spirits, or even No Face from Spirited Away, those kinds of concepts of this, I guess, Asian inspired aesthetic of a spirit world, because Avatar the Last Airbender is very Asian inspired when they're with their art style. Those wouldn't really fit this world. So they could have gone a route that has been done in the past, and it would have just felt a little dissonant from the rest of the world of Avatar. And so I think that this is the first time we really get to see what is the spirit world like, and I think it's just done very well. Another scene I really like is the scene where Zhang is sitting and he says he won't train Aang, and then we have this shift where now it's Roku standing there, and the fact that the fire is all extinguished when Roku is talking to him, and that tree that is dead in Zhang's room is now alive and lively, and then just that aesthetic film, that kind of sepia tone, kind of beige, black and white-ish color over that scene is just very poignant and very powerful, and it seems like it aesthetically tells the viewer that this is having an impact on Zhang, and not just like this crazy thing happened like when Roku appeared in the Fire Sage's temple. Mm-hmm. It's just something that's very specific to Zhang, and it's unique to him. And so I think that was done very tastefully as well, and it visually is different from where we've seen Roku appear in the past. Some of the visuals are also just really cinematic. Some shots of the camera work, if you will, is just really cinematic. Specifically, like that zoom in on Zhao when he realizes that the swords belong to the blue spirit that also belong to Zuko. The zoom in on Aang in episode 19 when he's standing there and the Fire Nation's coming. There's this zoom of the camera towards Aang's back. That's the same zoom from the intro of the show. Mm-hmm. And it's just a great tie-in, kind of come full circle for that whole first season.
It's a good homage.
Yeah. So a couple things there, and then I like that, as always, Avatar the Last Airbender is introducing these new creatures. There's the koala otter that we see very briefly. There's this kind of yak horse animal that's in the Northern Water tribe. These turtle seals that Zuko moves past. So just constantly just continuing with the creature design and the world building, and that this is not our world, but it is a world, and there are things in this world that would be present if you were following a character through the world.
Yeah.
So a lot of thought put into it. And then you already touched on a lot of the bending and the combat, so I'm not going to touch on that, but that was also a note I had as well, particularly with Katara and Master Pakku, but then even with with Zuko and Katara, and that fire versus water and fire versus ice towards the end there is just done really well. So all in all, I gave it 2 out of 2 points. I really couldn't find any negatives for me, but of course I'm not quite as critical with the aesthetics as I am with the other categories. So 2 out of 2 for me.
Okay. Next category is personal taste and preference. Out of 2 points, I gave it 1.5. These are very, very strong episodes. These are incredibly necessary episodes in regards to the storytelling, like sort of peaking us up to the big conflict of the season and then resolving us out nicely. The only reason I didn't give this full points for personal taste and preference is they are not my favorite episodes in the season. But it doesn't mean that they're not good. And so this was a harder one for me to score, because I was trying to look at these as like in the context of the season and where we are in the story. And just because they're not my personal favorite episodes in the season doesn't mean that they aren't or shouldn't be yours. And they may objectively be the best episodes if you were to ask somebody other than me. They're incredibly strong episodes, and I think, our discussion so far has made that very evident. But just, if I were to, like, pick and choose episodes from season 1 that I would, like, go back and rewatch, which I have done before, like, just, I'm not watching everything, like, chronologically. Episodes like The Storm, are episodes that I'm really, the Blue Spirit. Those are episodes that like they stick into my head for longer. You know, even things like, I don't know, like I like the Warriors of Kyoshi episode a lot too. So like those episodes are episodes that I personally just love and have like an attachment to. And that's the only reason I didn't give it full points. But it's other than that I have no big problems with anything in these 5 episodes. So just 1.5 points for me out of 2.
Yeah, so I'm kind of in the same boat. I gave this 1 out of 2 points for me. These are just not some of my favorite episodes. I think they're excellent. They're great quality episodes, but they're just not some of my favorites. The Deserter is one that grows on me the more I watch it, and I think it's because Zhang Zhang is just such an interesting character, like you kind of touched on. You know, the Northern Air Temple is not one that I enjoy. I think the plot of episode 18, the Waterbending Master, is just kind of weak. Episodes 19 and 20 are great finale episodes, but for me, it's just more like a good setup for what comes next rather than episodes I want to rewatch. So overall, I'm right there in the same boat. I think The Storm, The Blue Spirit, those episodes are ones that I would go back and rewatch, but most of season 1 in general is just not my favorite season. And
I also agree.
These episodes, even though they're very strong episodes, they're very necessary. If you're going to watch the show as a whole, the whole show, don't skip them by any means, but they're just not ones that I would go back and watch again, because I think the overall season 1 just is setting you up, is a lot of strong foundation. And then, in my opinion, season 2 and 3 just get better and better.
That's what I was going to say. Like, not to spoil anything, but like if you're watching Avatar for the first time, like along with these episodes, or if you have been watching Avatar before, or maybe have not finished the series, I would recommend genuinely like continue all the way to the end, because this is a show that builds in quality and storytelling, and the best of season 1 just gets better and better as you go into seasons 2 and 3. Genuinely, I think this show is one of the best TV series that have ever existed. But you must have the foundation of season 1 in order to truly appreciate seasons 2 and 3. So if you're like still on the fence about whether you should watch or finish Avatar the Last Airbender, do it. That would be my final note in regards to personal taste and preference.
Yeah, I would agree completely.
Okay, so sorry, did you have anything else to say about that before I move on? Okay. Last category, creativity. Out of 1 point, I gave it that full point because this is a great final conflict. And not only that, but it gives a new taste of the plot's depth and character abilities. We're seeing our characters that we are now very familiar with at this point in the show. We're seeing new things happen and new reactions happen because there are new things. But the way that everything is handled is still very true to character. And we are getting these very interesting new plot depths and very interesting new conflicts that are not just your same run-of-the-mill character of the week problems that Aang's having to solve. It's not, oh, these two tribes are fighting and now I have to play mediator. Like, we're getting stakes high problems with no clear solution, and now we have to figure it out. And so because of that, I think everything that they do in regards to these last 5 episodes is a very big problem, and then it has to be a very smart and creative solution, and none of it feels disgenuine the entire time. So to somehow solve so many problems in 5 episodes and still make it feel natural to the world and to the characters that we've established, I think is an incredibly great commendation toward the creativity of the creators. So full point for me.
Alrighty. I actually give it half a point out of 1 for creativity. I think episodes 16, 17, and 18 are really just on par with Avatar the Last Airbender and just in other really good kid/teen TV shows. I mean, Avatar the Last Airbender, I feel like overall is in kind of a league of its own, but 16, 17, and 18 feel kind of like your episode of the week shows. even though some of them are very good, I don't think any of them are ones that really stand out as far as creativity goes. But episodes 19 and 20 just really set the bar, and they brought in new and creative aspects of the world of Avatar the Last Airbender and set it up for future seasons and, bigger and better things moving forward. So because of that, I don't feel like all of the episodes meet that criteria for creativity. I give it half a point out of 1.
Okay.
So what is your total score?
My final score is 8 out of 10.
And my final score is 7.5 out of 10.
Sounds good.
Alrighty. Any final thoughts?
No, I think I said everything I need to say.
Let me pull up lightning round. So, favorite character or new character in these 5 episodes?
Okay, my favorite character is and continues to be Iroh, but if I were to pick a new character, I would probably pick Zhang.
Yeah.
So,
I think same. Zuko is my favorite character. But I think of the new characters we're introduced to, I think Zhang is probably my favorite, and he becomes more of my favorite as I rewatch these episodes. Least favorite character in these episodes?
Maybe Paku. If I don't pick Zhao, because Zhao's just so easy to hate, but Paku is just. He's just kind of annoying and like sort of weak-willed, I think, and that's made evident, but he's not a terrible character. I just think of all the characters that we meet throughout the course, he's just kind of meh.
Yeah,
so
I would agree. I would say Paku as mine for the exact same reasons, actually. Is there any moment in these episodes that you would rewrite or change?
I kind of mentioned this before, so I'll just kind of use that as my answer. I just want to put Zhang's episode somewhere else, like chronologically in the story. But that's really the only thing I think I would change is just where it falls.
Yeah.
So
I think I would do what we kind of talked about already as far as giving Paku a different reason to not teach Katara and for a different reason to change his mind other than, not necessarily a different reason for him to change his mind, but something other than I'm honoring our years of tradition, because it just seems so insignificant traditions than if you could upset it with one person and a necklace. So yeah. I just think it's just really weak. Which mentor would you choose to learn from? Zhang, Teo's dad, or Master Paku?
I would probably cry a little bit, but Zhang.
Yeah.
He'd probably be kind of mean to me and I'd cry, but I think it would be the most beneficial teaching.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I mean, Teo's dad would be kind of cool. He seems like
cool.
A fun guy to work with, but he's had a lot of accidents.
It's true.
And I don't want to have an accident and get my fingers chopped off.
When Sokka was like, so this is just a place ready to blow, and he was like, yep. And I was like, oh, dang.
Yeah, sounds kind of dangerous. So I think I'd pick Zhang. Which of these 3 locations would you like an animated short or side adventure quest to take place? The Fire Nation Village from episode 16, the Northern Air Temple, or the North Pole?
I'm going to say the Northern Air Temple. What would be really cool is if we could see when the refugees first, come to the Air Temple. I think that would be a really interesting short.
Yeah.
So
I would want a little short in the Fire Nation Village from episode 16 with the guy that is the second deserter. I cannot remember his name.
Oh, yeah. When he's like, you get really famous for being the first deserter of the Fire Nation, but nobody cares about the second guy.
Yeah,
or whatever.
that guy.
Yeah.
With that guy, just like his little side adventure for like what happened to him after, because everybody left and he's like, guys, where'd everybody go?
Yeah.
So I'd want to see that.
That'd be funny.
If you could bring back any character from season 1, so the whole season, and reunite them with the Aang gang in season 2, who would you pick?
I would pick Suki.
Yeah.
I'd pick Suki.
Because you really like that episode.
I really like that episode. I think the Kyoshi Warriors are really cool. And they're introduced really early, and I think they're just like a really neat facet to the world. So because I like the Kyoshi Warriors so much, and Suki is the one we get to know the best, I would bring her back.
Yeah. I think I would want to bring back or bring forward. I don't think it technically counts, but I would say Zuko as the Blue Spirit. I would like to see some more like adventures with him in that role. But I feel like that's a cop-out because he's clearly, moving forward in this show. But I would like to see the herbalist from the episode of The Blue Spirit.
Oh, okay.
I feel like you could just have a really interesting plot with her.
Yeah.
Because
that's a good point.
She's weird and wacky.
Yeah.
But she knows a lot. Or June is a good character.
June's a cool
she would be a good character to bring back. But I feel like that'd be really easy. I'm like, I want to know like this herbalist. Like such an eclectic, like brief character. And I feel like that I would want to see her make a recurrence and see
what's
she's
the
up
little
to.
Girl's name in the
fortune teller?
The fortune teller.
Mang.
It would be fun to have her back for a moment.
Yeah. You wouldn't want to see Aunt Wu?
No, I would want to punch her in the face again. I don't know why I feel such violent tendencies.
You do. You just hate Aunt Wu. You're a hater. All right. What would you like to see happen next in season 2? So, full disclosure, Tori and I have seen this whole show. So we're pretending for a minute that we have not seen season 2 at all. So what would you like to see?
Definitely more focus on like disciplines, like bending disciplines. So, I want to see Aang starting to take really seriously his water bending and other bendings. So I definitely a focus there. But also, since Katara has now been dubbed waterbending master, I want to see her continuing to just hone the skills and find out like how far can she push the limits, what new interesting things can she come up with. I want to see like creativity happening in like her bending. And then if I were to like talk about Sokka, I think we sometimes gloss over Sokka because he's not a bender, but I think he still obviously has his role in the team that's very important. And so, I want to see him spending time just increasing his own skills with his boomerang. And then not only that, but just like he's a very good strategist, I think. He's very smart. He's a smart guy. So just more focus on that. And, we think of Sokka as like the haha funny guy who's clumsy, which is true of him, but it's not all of him. And so I want to see, I like seeing the moments where he follows his gut. We talked about that episodes ago when we were talking about the Jet episode and how Sokka really does have a very good sense of discernment and that should be used to his benefit. And so I want to see him be able to sort of use that in more ways. So mostly I think ideal season 2 is just continuing to grow the characters that we like in ways that make sense so that they're still familiar to us, but they're not staying the same. Nobody wants a stagnant protagonist team.
Yeah. I think the two things I would like to see in season 2 is like what you said about Sokka. I would really like to see Sokka on like a mission where he can really highlight all of his natural gifts. So he's extremely gifted in strategy and, infiltrating, new spots, thinking through creatively, coming up with new ways to do things or a new invention or a new process. And so I really would want to see Sokka kind of have some time to shine in season 2. Another thing I really would like to see in season 2 is we've just kind of peeled back this first layer of the onion with Iroh and Zuko's relationship. And I would love to see things go deeper with the two of them. So like dig a little more into how Zuko and Iroh continue to move forward in this kind of surrogate father, surrogate son relationship that they have. And I think that it could be something really beautiful at the end because we've cracked the door just barely open. And so I'd like to see more of that. And then in addition to that, not just in their relationship with each other, but we've seen this really interesting side of Iroh where he values the spirit world. And we even saw in the episode where he gets captured by the Earth Nation, where Aang is flying by on the Roku's spirit guide in the spirit world, and Iroh maybe sees it, so there's some connection that Iroh has, that he's not just strictly loyal to the Fire Nation. And so I'd like to see more into that, like where that came from and why he feels that way, and then kind of how that's going to progress moving forward. So those are two things that if I was writing season 2, I would want to kind of hone in on there.
Nice.
Alrighty. Any final thoughts on Avatar the Last Airbender Season 1 as a whole?
No, like I said, it's a wonderful show. And if you haven't seen it, I would highly encourage you to.
Yeah. My final thoughts would be like, if you've made it this far and you're watching this for the first time, maybe you're watching the animated show because you're going to be watching the Netflix show that airs next year or something like that. I just would highly, highly encourage you, if you made it through season 1 and you're like, I don't know if this show is for me, please keep going, because season 1, in my opinion, is the weakest season.
It is.
It's still great. I think it's a great show. It's a great season, but of the 3 seasons, it's the weakest because it has so much foundational work to lay. So if you're you're still on the fence about continuing and watching season 2, just push through. Just keep going. Season 2 and 3, I think, gets so much better. Thank you guys so much for joining us on this episode. We hope you had a good time, and if you didn't, feel free to tell us why. Links to our show notes, Patreon, socials, and a suggestion box are all on our website at lineandmousepodcast.com. You can also review this episode on whichever podcast platform you prefer and let us know what you think. Thanks so much for listening, guys, and we will catch you in the next one.